Welcome to the Camel Clutch Blog, the debut Camel Clutch Blog Extra, where we take a deeper look into one of the more popular blogs on the website. And today's blog is really, this one's been a real popular blog, a lot of talk around this one. I've gotten a lot of feedback on Twitter and on Facebook and even just emails. People that aren't even wrestling fans these days, that maybe were old school fans, were reading this and they wanted to chime in with theirs. So I thought it'd be fun to take a look at it and break it down as we talk today, the top 10 best WWE heel turns in history. And I couldn't think of anybody else better to join me than my good friend Brian Fritz. Brian contributes sometimes to the Camel Clutch blog, but he's busy with BetweenTheRopes.com. Brian, welcome here to the Camel Clutch blog Extra.
Thanks for having me, man.
No, it's my pleasure. So let's get into it here. Well, we'll kind of just freeform here and see where it goes. I'll go down the list, and if you got anything to say about it, if you want to add some things that aren't on the list, we'll just throw it around.
Sounds good.
Beautiful. So my list here that I put together on CamelClutchBlog.com, it's not in any particular order, but let's start with the first one here. And this one I want to talk a little bit about. It is when The Rock's uncle, Peter Maivia, the High Chief Peter Maivia, turned heel on Bob Backlund. Now, I'm a pretty old dude, Brian, but I never watched this one. This one aired in 1978. So I was just a little pup then. I started watching wrestling about 4 years later, but I'd always heard about this angle. And I went on YouTube, and I found it. Somebody had a pretty fuzzy version of it, but I found it. And I had to be honest, it is one of the best angles that I've ever seen. Maivia just brutalizes, just absolutely brutalizes Arnold Skaaland. For those of you out there that didn't hear it, the quick and dirty of it is Maivia and Backlund were teaming up against Victor Rivera and Spiros Arion. And the Arion and Rivera were double teaming Backlund, and Maivia wasn't helping. They finally threw Backlund outside the ring, so Backlund's manager Arnold Skaaland got in Maivia's face and started yelling at him, and Maivia just pounded the living daylights out of Skaaland. I mean, it was brutal. And Backlund tried to help him, and Maivia just threw him off, and he ripped apart Skaaland's clothes. It was awesome. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but just your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it was wild. And it's funny because when you talk about heel turns from a different era, we wonder about, how they look a little bit more brutal. They look a lot more real because the physicality was something that they really focused on then, especially for a heel turn. It wasn't just one kick or one thing that they did. I hit a guy with a DDT and I just laid him out. I mean, they really put the boots to somebody when they did a heel turn. And it's funny you said that about all the different things he did to him because Maivia, like you said, went nuts. Yeah. I mean, he's beating him up. He's choking him with his own shirt, So, I mean, it's fantastic to see that they go to that lengths to just talk about, if I'm going to do it, I'm really going to do it.
Yeah, and it's funny too because there a lot of fans or even just non-fans, probably more so, will have some fun. They'll go on YouTube and they'll look at wrestling from the 80s and 70s and kind of joke about how much slower it was back then and maybe how much more phony it looked compared to some of the more high-impact wrestling that you see today. But I got to be honest, I haven't seen a heel turn this brutal in years.
Oh, absolutely, man, and you won't. I mean, I think the thing that's closest to it is, we'll get to it coming up, and it's kind of close, is when Shawn Michaels turned on Marty Jannetty.
Yeah.
Just because that one was more of a shock moment, but it was one action, but it was a brutal action that he did.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it. You brought it up, Shawn and Marty, and it's funny because, in doing this list and just kind of thinking back to being a fan in the 80s and the 90s and even some of the stuff that I've read about in the 70s, you think about these big heel turns, and most of the bigger ones involved the WWE Championship. It involved the Tag Team Championship. It was a big deal. But this one was a mid-card. I mean, Shawn there was no Intercontinental title, at stake here, or at this point anyway. They weren't Tag Team Champions at this point. It was just a mid-card feud. And when you look back at these heel turns, this one may be the most famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, in regards to mid-card stuff you see every week now on Raw. But this one still resonates. This was 92, so 20-plus years later.
Yeah, and it's funny because we talk about the brutality of when you want to turn on a guy. There was one sole action that happened. Well, it was two, actually. There was a kick, but then throwing a guy through a window. And that was something we had never really seen before.
Yeah.
So to do something that was that unique, that brutal, and the image of Marty Jannetty hanging on this windowsill, more or less, with shattered glass all around him, and the smirk on Shawn Michaels' face was awesome. And if anybody doesn't remember it, I mean, the whole thing was there was tension between the Rockers, and they're like all gonna, we're gonna make up out here, on Brutus Beefcake's show. So they got their arms up together, and then Shawn just blasts him with a kick, and you've got Bobby Heenan going, I knew he was going to do that, and next thing you know, you're like, okay, what's he going to do? And he picks him up and he throws him through a window. You're like, the crowd is just in shock, when he do this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I remember watching it back then, and 92 was I guess the time for me where I wasn't as big a fan as I was when I was younger, because I'm getting I'm in my teenage years, and now wrestling is it's not as cool as it used to be. But I just remember really enjoying this one and really loving it. And I mean, it's memorable. And like you said, it's that glass moment. And you didn't see a lot of it back then. You still don't see a lot with glass these days or anything this brutal. And I just think it's such a testament to these guys that they were able to take, what was essentially a mid-card angle and turn it into one of the most memorable of all time.
Yeah, and that's one of the ones that WWE will always show when you talk about stunning heel turns or big moments that have happened over the years, is when Shawn Michaels turned on Marty Jannetty. Yeah,
absolutely. So going down the list here, the next one that I have on the blog is we'll go back to 1986, and Paul Mr. Wonderful Orndorff turning on Hulk Hogan. And I want to get into this a little bit with you because I've had a lot of conversation around this specific turn in regards to the blog, and the feedback that I've gotten from a lot of the people that have read that if you really look at the storyline, and if you were a fan back then, or you go back on YouTube and you watch everything that led up to it, in reality, Orndorff was right. And Orndorff is almost like the babyface here. He calls Hogan for help. Hogan says he's not available, doesn't even come to the phone. Hogan's busy, working out and posing or whatever, and Orndorff's finally had enough. And you look at it, and you even look back at some of these angles that Hogan was in, and we'll talk about Hogan and Savage on the list. And a lot of these, if you really look at it logically, the guys that turned on Hogan, they kind of had a right to do so. Savage, Hogan's, palming his girl's thigh, when he's holding her up. So, you look back at this Orndorff Hogan angle, and you almost sympathize a little bit with Mr. Wonderful.
You're right about Hogan, because a lot of the times that we've seen people turn on him, it's like, put yourself in that shoes. It's justified. Even Andre the Giant, when he turned on him, because Hogan was hogging the spotlight. He's Andre the Giant. He's never had the WWE Championship. So Bobby Heenan put a bug in his ear, and guess what? He's going to do it. But can you blame him? I mean, Andre was right. And the same thing when you talk about Savage. I mean, people are going to be very protective about the ones closest to him, especially their wives or girlfriends. And Randy Savage thought that Hogan was giving his girl the eye, So that was that. Don't you dare do that, And like, he's carrying his wife or manager, whatever you want to call him at the time, but we all know what's going on. He's carrying her to the back and abandoning him in this match. Now he comes back, but it's just like, what are you doing, my girl? So I mean, there's been plenty of times where you sit there and go, well, Hulk Hogan, the character, when you really dissect it, not the nice guy like you'd all think.
Yeah, it's amazing. It really is when you look back on it now as adults and you kind of take a step back and look at it. But this Orndorff turn on Hogan, I don't think it gets enough credit. When I was looking at lists that were put together in doing a little research for this one was left off of a lot of lists. And I'm not sure why. I mean, I just look, and maybe it was just me and just having a fondness for that era, but even the idea that you had Hogan and Orndorff against Studd and Bundy on television is just ridiculous to think about during that era. And I remember going to a couple of those Orndorff Hogan matches at the Spectrum. I went to one right after WrestleMania 1, where Orndorff was kind of a tweener. He hadn't fully turned, but he was starting to get cheered. And at the end of the match, Hogan and Orndorff shook hands. And then I went to one, later on. I think it was like 2 years later or so, after the Orndorff Hogan turn, and it was awesome. I mean, just the intensity, the matches, they were just great.
Oh yeah, and the thing is too that Orndorff, he's one of those guys. He was an all-in kind of guy.
Mm.
He was very intense. So that was one of the things I really liked about Paul, especially in his heyday. And I think he always felt like he had a chip on his shoulder because he wanted to prove, like, I belong. I'm a main eventer. You know, it was like, why was I not given the Hogan spot? Or why do people not look at me the same way they do Hogan when it comes to star quality? So he was really into these things.
Yep.
And the details that would go into it and just the intensity from Paul especially, I thought was fantastic.
Yes, and you're right. And I mean, have you interviewed Paul on Between the Ropes?
I have. It's been years ago, but yeah, and I don't want to say Paul is a bitter guy because I wouldn't say that, but Paul still has that chip on his shoulder.
Yeah, I was going to say I interviewed him. I want to say 2007, and he was a great interview. But yeah, not only did he have the chip on his shoulder, but he doesn't like Hogan, and it sounded like he never really liked him to begin with.
Right. Yeah, he's just kind of like, I don't know why he got what he got, and felt like Hogan was handed everything way too easily and didn't earn it.
Yeah. All right. So
I can only imagine if Paul was right now what he thinks about guys training at the Performance Center for WWE and just getting signed within 2 years, maybe being on the main roster.
Oh my God! You know that he's one of those guys that I lost touch with. That I wish I stayed in touch with because he was a phenomenal interview and he was just as good on the phone setting up the interview.
Yes.
So, let's stick with Hogan as we go down the list here. And we've already talked about Randy Savage and Hogan. And there are a lot of people out there, a lot of wrestling writers and journalists that cite the Savage turn on Hogan in '89 as the greatest angle in WWE history. I don't know if I would go that far, but there are a lot of people that would. And the key to it all is that they say the key to it all that most point to is the fact that it took place over a year. That from when Savage won the belt at WrestleMania 4 all the way to when he turned on him before WrestleMania 5, that it all built up. There was a roadmap, and they had little subtle hints along the way. And I think that what's really cool about that, if you look back on it, is it was so predictable. I mean, it was just so predictable from the second that Savage gave him that glance at WrestleMania 4, yet it worked. And it's funny because you look at today, and one of the big criticisms of WWE is that everything's predictable, that you can see things a mile away. A guy's turning, 2 months ahead of time, the guy's turning. But, if done right, predictability, I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
I totally agree. And it's one of my little things I pick on when it comes to that, because I don't have a problem with things being predictable. I don't, as long as the buildup is done right and you get the payoff. And that's the beauty of wrestling, is that you can make that entertaining. What was it? How many years ago was it when it was going to be Shawn Michaels against John Cena at WrestleMania?
Yeah.
We knew that Shawn was going to super kick Cena.
Yeah.
We just didn't know when that was going to happen. So we kept waiting, and it teased, and it teased, and it teased. And then on the final Raw, before the pay-per-view, whammy. He got nailed,
yes.
you know? So it's like, that was awesome, And I love the reaction from the crowd. Jim Ross was on the call. Oh, my God,
Yes.
It's like, I mean, you knew it was coming, though. And that was the great thing about Savage and Hogan, because just the little subtleties, the layers that went into it, doing, a year-long build to get to that point where they actually had the match and then the turn along the way. And I don't have a problem with anybody calling this the greatest storyline, the greatest angle that WWE has ever done, because of how long they put into this, how long it took for everything to happen. And then it was the two biggest stars of the company at the time, the little details that went into it, and the emotion that got put into it because it was such big superstars, but also because of the involvement of Elizabeth.
Yes, the X Factor.
Yes,
absolutely. Just to wrap that one up, we talk about predictable, and you talk about how predictable can be a good thing. I don't want to tip my hat too much because I'm working on a top 10 baby faces term, but one of the angles that I already have in there is the Batista angle when he turned babyface on Triple H, and I mean, again, that thing was building up for about 6 to 8 months, but yet it worked.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we're going to see Batista back at WrestleMania coming up next year.
I hope so. I thought Big Dave was awesome. That run that he had on the
final
way out.
year or so that he had,
yeah.
He was great.
Yeah, one of my favorites. One of my favorites of the last couple of years. But we can get into that at a different time. But yes, we're both on the same page there. Welcome edition back. So as we go on the list, let's go to another legendary angle. And for people of this generation, this was their Hogan Savage. This was their Austin McMahon. I don't know what the big angle would be of this generation, but it was Larry Zbyszko turning on Bruno Sammartino. And you watch it back, and and I love Bruno, but in regards to some of the other angles and some of the other clips that I watched leading up to this, it's not anything nearly, I don't think, as brutal as like a Peter Maivia or anything as dramatic as Savage and Hogan, but it worked. And I mean, maybe in that regard, you had to be living in that time period. You had to really have that emotional investment that I didn't have. But that was one of the biggest, and it's an angle that for people of that generation, I mean, they'll tell you, Brian. I'm sure I'm sure wrestlers that you've talked to that grew up in that generation will tell you that it's the greatest angle that ever took place.
There'll be some people that will tell you that, and it's one of the ones that they remember because it was a shocker from the standpoint of you did this against the legend, against Bruno, and nobody did that to Bruno, and especially the guy that was his student, in Larry Zbyszko. So that, I think that's what stands out to people is that they did it on the big stage, the way that they ended up paying it off with the big Shea Stadium match. So but for anybody to do anything bad against Bruno Sammartino, who is beloved for so many years, that was the thing that stood out.
Yeah, a couple of notes on that, the Shea Stadium match. Hulk Hogan, in his book, takes credit for drawing that crowd because of his match with Andre the Giant. And I brought that up to Bruno on my radio show, and he went ballistic, as you could probably expect.
Oh, I'm sure he did.
And the other thing, and I don't know if Bruno was working me or not. I kind of think he wasn't because I've never really gotten that impression from him with anything that he's told me. He's always been pretty straight up. But from what Bruno was telling me, that like Larry Zbyszko really was his true life pupil. In that Larry used to bug him, used to send letters to his house, used to come to his house to ask him to train to be a wrestler. And again, I don't really know the motivation of him making up a story like that, but from what he's told me, that these guys were real life teacher student.
Yeah, I didn't really know it went to that depths. I knew that they were friends, but I didn't know it went to that depth. So. We always talk about some of the things that you take from real life turn out the best in wrestling, and this was probably a case of that.
Yeah, good stuff. So we'll go down the list here. This one was a little controversial in that some people thought it didn't belong on the list. Some people didn't see it as historic as some of the others, although I disagree. I think there's a little personal bias here. But this was Stephanie McMahon turning on Vince McMahon. I thought for that particular time, nobody expected it. Nobody expected after she was drugged and taken through the chapel that she was into it, that she was in on the game plan. And the moment when she hugs Triple H in that match, I think it was at Armageddon against Vince McMahon. I mean, the place just went nuts. She had that smirk on her face. And I think there's a little personal bias here. I think there are some people that just hate Stephanie McMahon and Triple H and don't want to give them the credit. But if you really look back on it and you look at the big picture here, it really was one of the best heel turns in WWE history.
I agree. And I know that she's not an in-ring performer for the most part. She's had some matches, but there definitely is a bias. But at the time, you remember that it was like so horrible what Triple H did.
Yeah.
Remember, because he took her to the Las Vegas drive-through chapel.
Yep.
And they got married, and he's like talking for her like, hey, I love this man. And just doing, and they were doing that whole bit. But just, the whole thing, because they remember the whole thing was Stephanie was the protected one. It's Vince McMahon's little girl. We had seen her from time to time, and now she was growing up, but she was still protected. And this was the big thing of, I'm my own person. I'm going my own way. And nobody really saw this one.
Yeah, no. This was great. And I mean, if you go back and you watch it, and that's what I did. I went back and watched a lot of these just to make sure that I was remembering these correctly. I mean, this was great. I mean, the way the fans react to this, and you know, you brought up Jim Ross earlier. One of Jim Ross's best calls ever was this heel turn. I mean, he was just awesome. When Triple H lined up that sledgehammer like he was going to hit Stephanie, and instead the two embraced, I mean, Jim Ross was just phenomenal. One of his best and most underrated calls ever.
I think the term slack-jawed would be perfectly fine there. He
Yes.
was gobstopped. I mean, he didn't know almost what to say.
Yes.
And so did the rest of the crowd. Everybody's like, oh, what?
Yes. This is great. If you haven't seen it, for those of you out there listening, I'd highly recommend going onto YouTube and searching it out, even if for anything, just to listen to the call from Jim Ross. So as we move down the list, you and I touched on this a bit earlier. Andre the Giant turning on Hulk Hogan in 1987, culminating in what some will say the greatest match in WWE history from a historic standpoint, from what it meant to the company. I thought what was really cool about this one, Brian, was here you had a feud that had taken place several years earlier. Everybody had seen it. I mean, they were on Shea Stadium. They were all over the place. They went to MSG. They went to the Spectrum. I know they were here at the Spectrum, I think, 3 times. So this was a feud that everybody had seen. You know, and then leading up to the angle, you had what could have been perceived as sympathy for Andre the Giant. He's 15 years undefeated. He's never gotten a championship match. He gets this trophy, and then all of a sudden Hulk Hogan comes out to steal the spotlight, and yet Andre is the big villain here. And I thought for everything involved, for what they pulled off, again, with a lot of these fans knowing the history and seeing how this played out, I think it was great what these guys pulled off.
Yeah, because, I mean, that was the match that people hadn't really thought about, but it was kind of like this dream scenario kind of match. And also, you got to remember the little subtleties and just kind of sometimes the happy accidents that happen. And remember when Andre pulled off he pulled off Hogan's shirt, but he also pulled off his gold chain, his gold cross. And when he did, it scraped across Hogan's chest.
Yes.
And it cut him. And just the little subtleties of that. And Hogan dropping down and picking up his gold chain. Andre, no. You know?
Yeah.
I give Hogan a lot of credit for that one.
Yeah.
But like just to see that cut across his chest from Andre grabbing that sacred gold chain was fantastic.
You know what I've always wondered, and I don't think I would ever get a straight answer asking anybody about this, is I always wondered if this angle was planted when Hogan won the title and Andre came in the locker room and poured the champagne over him. I always wondered if at that time, if part of Vince's master plan when he brought Hogan back was, okay, in 2-3 years we're going to do a big match with you and Andre the Giant. Always wondered that.
I don't know. That'd be a good question to find out.
Yeah, I don't think we'd ever get a straight answer because the only people you could ask are Hogan, and who knows what answer.
Are you saying you can't trust what comes out of Hulk Hogan's mouth?
I never said that.
Hey, brother.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get an attorney on call for that one. But all right, so. But that is a question I've always wondered. Moving down the list here, only a couple more, and then we'll be out of time. And then I want to get to, I know, Brian, you put together a little list of heel turns that didn't appear on the list here. So let me kind of just go through a couple, and we'll talk about them. We'll cluster them together. The next two, Steve Austin turning on The Rock, 2001, WrestleMania. I mean, this one's historic for a lot of reasons. Some of them not good, as many have reflected on this as one of the worst heel turns for business in the history of the company. But then you had Paul Bearer turning on The Undertaker in 1996. And, again, this is an angle that often gets forgotten. And I guess it's because WWE wasn't as hot in 1996. But, when Bearer turned on Undertaker and aligned himself with Mankind, I just thought that was phenomenal. And, you look back on it, and, again, listening to the call and just kind of the fan reaction, one of the great moments.
Yeah, it was. It was funny because he said at the time, maybe WWE wasn't as big, but this was actually one of the biggest feuds that they had in a while. And talking about Mankind against Undertaker for how long it lasted and the different kinds of matches that they had. And then you've got Steve Austin, who turned on The Rock at WrestleMania 17. And Steve Austin will tell you to this day, worst decision of his life. Because he was the one that wanted to turn heel. Because he thought, I think I've done everything I can as a babyface. It's time to turn heel. This makes sense. But nobody wanted to not only see Austin as a heel, but especially align himself with Vince McMahon, who is his number one nemesis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look back on it, I remember at the time, not a business decision that I would have made, but it was a fun angle at the time, seeing Austin with McMahon and Austin as a heel and some of the things they were doing. I think what's really more surprising in retrospect, if you remember that time period, was just, he teamed with Triple H as that two-man power trip, but it was really Triple H that took the spotlight, and it was Austin kind of as the Robin to Triple H, the Batman of the team.
Yeah, it was. But I remember at the time I hated it.
Yeah.
I really did, because I did not want to see him with McMahon. I did not want to see him with Triple H.
Yeah.
Because they had already done so much when it comes to the matches and the hatred and all the different things. There's a certain point where you can say, okay, we've done this to each other, but now we respect one another, we can align. But the things that he had done, especially against McMahon, I thought just didn't make sense for the heel turn.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, if Andre the Giant could get past getting his hair cut, I'm not talking about getting his hair shaved, but getting a well-needed hair trim from Bobby the Brain Heenan, then why can't Austin McMahon put their differences aside? and I literally mean a haircut.
Right.
That angle. So finally on the list we go to what probably would be the top slot if we took a poll on the website. That would be Vince McMahon turning heel on Bret Hart in 1997. And what's funny about that is, if you look back, Bret was the heel, at the time, and he had that tweener thing going on, and Vince was just getting abused at different times on television by Bret. But yet in the end, Vince McMahon winds up turning on Bret Hart. And if you look at this from a business point of view, maybe financially the greatest heel turn in WWE history.
Yeah, and it's funny because at the time everybody sided, with Bret, and there's still a lot of people that do with the whole way that went down. But it turned out to be a fantastic business move for not only saving money and letting Bret walk and then getting totally misused in WCW, but it brought about Vince McMahon being a character that everybody could galvanize around to hate.
Yep.
And it just did so much for the WWE at the time. And then you had the guy that you could get behind, and that was Steve Austin, who hated the boss, gave him the finger, told him what you wanted to say, things that you could kind of live vicariously through, and everybody hated Vince at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, just great stuff. So there you go. There is my list of WWE top 10. I know you had some different ones in mind.
Well, was there anything off the top of your head that you thought of that did not happen in WWE that you think of for a heel turn?
Oh, well, I mean, I think the best one would be Hogan's in WCW.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That one. Flair, and I remember watching this as a kid because we had just gotten NWA Mid-Atlantic here, but when Flair turned on Dusty to join the Horsemen, that was a really cool angle if you look back on it, because, and again, just going off the top of my head and trying to go from memory of 30-something years ago, but, Flair was a babyface, Dusty was coming into the cage to help Flair, and then Flair was like, who the hell are you to come in here and help me? And then all of a sudden, Dusty, who came in to help Flair against the Andersons, I think it was, winds up getting beaten down by Flair and the Andersons.
Right. Yeah, that. You also had, the Freebirds.
Yes.
From years ago. One of my favorite ones, too, because it was some that I actually watched at the time, being down here. I'm in Florida, so I watched a lot of NWA. Mm-hmm. But back in '89, where Ric Flair was finishing up his feud with Ricky Steamboat, and he finally beats Steamboat and wins the championship. And Terry Funk, who was calling the match, afterwards got in the ring and congratulated Flair, but then said, I'd also like to challenge you for it. And Rick says, hey, I respect you, but we have a top 10 list now. You're not in the top 10. You've been out, in Hollywood with Sylvester Stallone and whatever. And Funk just gets more and more agitated. And then, bam, that's it, and he just flips on him. And that's one of the first times you'll ever see anybody get pile-driven on a table. Now, the table did not break, but he got pile-driven on a table.
Yes.
And then Flair fell to the ground. Funk had the table flipped over on top of him to where only his head was exposed, and then hit him with a chair.
Yeah.
It was so brutal, and Funk was freaking out in the tux while he was doing all this too. It was so great.
Yeah, that was great. That was one of my favorites. I just remember when Funk came into WCW and they did that angle. I just remember marking out, like a little kid. I was starting to get older then, and wrestling was not necessarily as cool as it was, but wrestling was pretty cool that year in 1989.
There was a couple of those. So Bret Hart when he turned on America,
Sure, definitely.
but the weird thing about that was too he was beloved in Canada.
Yeah.
So border wars were on right there.
Yes.
Sergeant Slaughter turned on the United States.
That one came up a lot. That one came up when I put the question out there. When I was starting to do the blog and asking fans, that one came up a lot. And the only reason I left that off the list is because, I don't remember it being like a big angle. It was like Slaughter appeared on TV one day, and then all of a sudden he's calling Americans maggots again. But it wasn't like he turned on anybody, unless I'm remembering it wrong.
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, just the whole premise of it, but the actual act of turning, that the one thing that happens, it wasn't that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Owen Hart turned on Bret.
Yes, that one came up a lot as well.
Jericho turning on HBK in 2008.
Yes, that one came up as well.
When Triple H turned on HBK when HBK had his comeback.
Yeah, I love that one.
They were doing the DX reunion, and let's get ready to suck it, and you're getting ready to pose, and wham, pedigree.
Yeah, I love the angle that they did where Triple H, when Shawn did his comeback, and it was Triple H that like jumped him or something like that. It came out on camera.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember I forget the details. I'm kind of sketchy on it, but yeah, I love that one. These are all angles, Brian, that a lot of people brought up, and it's funny because everybody's got their own top 10, and there's just so many great ones when you open up the vault and you really start to dig in a little bit.
Right. Do you remember when Batista turned on Ray?
Yes.
I thought you were my friend, and now I'm gonna kill you, or something like that. He said, and he is.
Yes.
Clotheslined him out of his boots.
Yes, that was a great one. I think the sad thing about this is you look at most of these angles, and it's hard to find a great turn in the last 5 years.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the only thing that's come even close that I wouldn't say is really that close, but
the Miz's turn.
I was thinking would CM Punk turned on The Rock.
Yeah.
I mean, Rock's in the ring, and out of nowhere, CM Punk slides in and hits it with a clothesline.
Yeah, good point.
But outside of that, there really isn't that great of heel turns, and I know people try to say, well, maybe we know too much or find out too much, but I don't agree with that. I really don't. I just think that sometimes predictable is fine. That's perfectly fine as long as you build it up and then you, excuse me, if you make it into a big enough deal, then it can be memorable.
Yeah. As we close out the podcast, what was an angle that you remember as a kid when you started watching wrestling where somebody turned, whether it was good guy or bad guy, that just like totally shocked you?
Probably when the Road Warriors attacked Dusty Rhodes and tried to take out his eye with one of the spikes in their pads.
Yes.
Oh my God, that was brutal.
Yes.
That was on excuse me, that was on the TBS show too.
Yep.
Remember. So that's in the studio show 605 to 805 on the Superstation. And the Road Warriors jump Dusty, get him in the ring, and they take their spiked shoulder pads and they're put in Dusty's eye.
Yeah.
And Dusty starts bleeding profusely, He's wearing his cowboy boots and his, plaid shirt and can't defend himself, and nobody's coming out to help him until after the fact, and he almost gets his eye taken out. That one, as a kid, I remember that. That was pretty brutal.
Yeah, that was brutal. That was brutal. I remember that too. That was a good one. I guess as far as brutal goes, I guess I don't know. Orndorff and Hogan wasn't brutal, but I just remember it as a kid. Andre again wasn't brutal, but I just remember it as a kid. I mean, as far as brutality goes, I mean, you and I will probably maybe at some point we'll do another podcast on great angles, but probably the most brutal one I remember was Piper and Snuka.
Oh, absolutely. And
yeah.
I talked to Piper, just a couple of months ago, and he'll swear by, that he really hurt Snuka in that angle, and he feels bad about it.
Yeah.
Now, I've had some people tell me, well, that's Piper still living the gimmick a little bit, but there's others that say, no, he really feels like he affected, not only did he affect Snuka's life for the rest of his life by hurting him, but he says that Snuka has never forgiven him for it.
Hey, at least they were able to put their differences aside and form a Survivor Series team.
Sure, why not?
Yes. Well, listen, man, I want to thank you very much for the inaugural Camel Clutch Blog Extra. I hope people enjoyed it. We'll probably do some more on this. Why don't you take a few minutes and plug away?
Everybody can go to BetweenTheRopes.com. You can check out there. You can follow us on Twitter at Between the Ropes, or you can follow me personally on Twitter at Brian Fritz.
Beautiful. Well, Brian, I want to thank you very much for joining the podcast today, and hopefully we'll do some more of these in the near future.
Sounds great. Thanks again for having me, man.
My pleasure. So my list here that I put together on CamelClutchBlog.com, it's not in any particular order, but let's start with the first one here. And this one I want to talk a little bit about. It is when The Rock's uncle, Peter Maivia, the High Chief Peter Maivia, turned heel on Bob Backlund. Now, I'm a pretty old dude, Brian, but I never watched this one. This one aired in 1978. So I was just a little pup then. I started watching wrestling about 4 years later, but I'd always heard about this angle. And I went on YouTube, and I found it. Somebody had a pretty fuzzy version of it, but I found it. And I got to be honest, like, it is one of the best angles that I've ever seen. Maivia just brutalizes, like just absolutely brutalizes Arnold Skaaland. For those of you out there that didn't hear it, the quick and dirty of it is Maivia and Backlund were teaming up against Victor Rivero and Spiros Arion. And the Arion and Rivera were double teaming Backlund, and Maivia wasn't helping. They finally threw Backlund outside the ring, so Backlund's manager Arnold Skaaland got in Maivia's face and started yelling at him, and Maivia just pounded the living daylights out of Skaaland. I mean, it was brutal. And Backlund tried to help him, and Maivia just threw him off, and he ripped apart Skaaland's clothes. It was awesome. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but just your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it was wild. And it's funny because when you talk about heel turns from like a different era, we wonder about, how they look a little bit more brutal. They look a lot more real because the physicality was something that they really focused on then, especially for a heel turn. It wasn't just like one kick or one thing that they did. I hit a guy with a DDT and I just laid him out. I mean, they really put the boots to somebody when they did a heel turn. And it's funny you said that about all the different things he did to him because Maivia, like you said, went nuts. Yeah. I mean, he's beating him up. He's choking him with his own shirt, So, I mean, it's fantastic to see that they go to that lengths to just talk about, if I'm going to do it, I'm really going to do it.
Yeah, and it's funny too because there a lot of fans, or even just non-fans, probably more so, will have some fun. They'll go on YouTube and they'll look at wrestling from the 80s and 70s and kind of joke about how much slower it was back then and maybe how much more phony it looked compared to some of the more high-end moves. So 20 plus years later. Yeah,
and it's funny because we talk about the brutality of when you want to turn on a guy. There was one sole action that happened. Well, it was two, actually. There was a kick, but then throwing a guy through a window, and that was something we had never really seen before.
Yeah.
So to do something that was that unique, that brutal, and the image of Marty Jannetty hanging on this windowsill, more or less, with shattered glass all around him, and the smirk on Shawn Michaels' face was awesome. And if anybody does remember it, I mean, the whole thing was there was tension between the Rockers, and they're like all gonna, we're going to make up out here, on Brutus Beefcake's show. So they got their arms up together, and then Shawn just blasts him with a kick, and you've got Bobby Heenan going, I knew he was going to do that, and next thing you know, you're like, okay, what's he going to do? And he picks him up, and he throws him through a window. You're like, the crowd is just in shock, when he do this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I remember watching it back then, and 92 was I guess the time for me where I wasn't as big a fan as I was when I was younger because I'm getting a Welcome to the Camel Clutch Blog, the debut Camel Clutch Blog Extra, where we take a deeper look into one of the more popular blogs on the website. And today's blog is really, this one's been a real popular blog. A lot of talk around this one. I've gotten a lot of feedback on Twitter and on Facebook and even just emails. People that aren't even wrestling fans these days that maybe were old school fans were reading this and they wanted to chime in with theirs. So I thought it'd be fun to take a look at it and break it down as we talk today the top 10 best WWE heel turns in history. And I couldn't think of anybody else better to join me than my good friend Brian Fritz. Brian contributes sometimes to the Camel Clutch blog, but he's busy with BetweenTheRopes.com. Brian, welcome here to the Camel Clutch blog Extra.
Thanks for having me, man.
No, it's my pleasure. So let's get into it here. Well, we'll kind of just freeform here and see where it goes. We'll go down. I'll go down the list, and if you got anything to say about it, if you want to add some things that aren't on the list, we'll just throw it around.
Sounds good.
Beautiful. Act wrestling that you see today, but I got to be honest, I haven't seen a heel turn this brutal in years.
Oh, absolutely, man, and you won't. I mean, I think the thing that's closest to it is we'll get to it coming up is, and it's kind of close, is when Shawn Michaels turned on Marty Jannetty.
Yeah,
just because that one was more of a shock moment, but it was one action, but it was like a brutal action that he did.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it. You brought it up, Shauna and Marty, and it's funny because in doing this list and just kind of thinking back to being a fan in the 80s and the 90s and even some of the stuff that I've read about in the 70s. You think about these big heel turns, and most of the bigger ones involved the WWE Championship. It involved the Tag Team Championship. It was a big deal. But this one was a mid-card. I mean, Shawn there was no Intercontinental title, at stake here, or at this point anyway. They weren't Tag Team Champions at this point. It was just a mid-card feud. And when you look back at these heel turns, this one may be the most famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, in regards to mid-card stuff you see every week now on Raw. But this one still resonates. This was '92.